Good afternoon. Glad to see you back here. We can start our breakout session on developments in Nato. And this will likely build up on what was said in the previous sessions by Ambassador Ducaro and the cyber commanders. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of the session, Mr. Keir Giles. Keir is an associate fellow at Chatham House and also the research director for the Conflict Studies Research Center in the UK. And Keir combines a technical background with in-depth study of the Russian approaches to exercise of power to develop analysis of the Russian approach to information warfare, including the subdomain of cyber conflict. And of course, I have to say that Keir is a good friend of CyCon. He has been here 8 times. And I even remember an email conversation from a few years ago where he said something in the lines of enough is enough, I had too many CyCons. But we are not willing to give up on good people, and we still managed to lure you here. So thank you for coming, and have a great session.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, lured back again. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from lunch. First thing this morning, we had 2 keynote speeches which were similar but very, very different. President Keir and Ambassador Zoran Ducaro both laid out their visions for cybersecurity, but they were substantially different in approach and content. From President Kaljulaid, we heard about Estonia's already existing substantial achievements in cyber integration and in building cybersecurity in by design. And we also heard about plans for Estonia making best possible use of the opportunity of the EU Council presidency to spread the good word about cybersecurity and try and spread best practice as well. Then from NATO, we heard a presentation which was couched much more in terms of policy statements, of declarations, of aspirations, of summit pledges. And if you're a cynic, you might look at the past history of NATO summit pledges and wonder whether or when they might ever actually be implemented in the future. Key among those, of course, we have now recognition of cyberspace as an operational domain. What does that actually mean? We heard already just before lunch from, in particular, Brigadier General Fossum about how this is a challenge, how to implement this, that nations within NATO have already been grappling with. So how much further has NATO itself got with that? Well, to help answer those questions, CyCon has, as always, put together a superb panel of well-informed experts to redress the balance. We have, from SHAPE, 2 gentlemen, Brad Bigelow, who is the Principal Technical Advisor for CIS at SHAPE, and Brigadier General Christos Athanasiadis, who is the ACOS, the Assistant Chief of Staff for Cyber. We also have an academic and legal perspective by Catherine Lotrionte, who will be saying about what NATO could or should perhaps be doing. But the key question is, recognition of cyber as an operational domain, what does it really mean? The decision has come down from NATO headquarters down the road. Brad, what does it mean to you at SHAPE? How will you be implementing this?
Well, thank you, Keir. And if I can, I'm not sure I can equal Admiral Hauer's wonderful interactive session, but to try to keep things going a little bit livelier after lunch here. The subject I'm going to focus on is this issue of mission assurance, shifting the focus of cyber defense. What does that mean for NATO? NATO command structure, NATO as a military alliance, and NATO as we work in the context of joint military operations. So we have, and as Ambassador Ducaro mentioned this morning, at the summit, the heads of states and government agreed that they would recognize cyberspace as a domain of operations in which we need to be able to defend ourselves as effectively as we do in the other domains, and that would serve intents of broadening our perspective in terms of defense and deterrence. Now, you would say, okay, now that's been declared, this should be fairly straightforward. How do we translate this into becoming an effective military operation? Fairly straightforward. We have a methodology we follow in NATO. It's a pretty good one, where we break down capabilities into the context of doctrine, what we call .mil-PFI, doctrine, organization, training, materiel needs, logistics, personnel, facilities, interoperability issues. And so there are certainly, if you are, and as General Athanasiadis will talk about a little bit later, we're in the midst of implementing the roadmap that's been approved by the nations for making cyberspace an operational domain. And those things that are straightforward are the ones that we're obviously busy at work on. But there are open questions when we talk about taking cyberspace and treating it as a domain in the context of joint military operations. And that's kind of what I want to talk about here today, is to just highlight some of the key questions, some of the key unique aspects of what I've heard. In fact, a number of people have said cyberspace is not unique, but it is different. Well, we need to talk about some of those key differences, and then what are some of the key consequences for us as we make this an effective operational capability in the context of NATO operations. So those questions, just a few questions that I want to highlight that are unique considerations of cyberspace, key differences of cyberspace that we have to come up with effective answers to if we want to make this into a real, viable operational capability. And this morning, someone asked General Fulmer here about, well, should NATO have a cyber command? I loved that answer, which was, let's figure out what cyberspace operations are before we decide what the organizational construct is. I think that's the right answer because, as I hope I will illuminate in this talk, there are some unique considerations that are not straightforward in simply applying as we might for other domains. So the first is the issue of what is cyberspace as a domain of operations. Because the first thing we need to recognize is cyberspace doesn't, in a traditional military operation, as is reflected in AJP 3, or Allied Joint Publication 3, which is basic doctrine for operations, we assign a commander a joint operational area. That's the area in which he is authorized to conduct operations. That's the area in which the rules of engagement are implied. That's the area in which the forces are going to be engaged. Well, what are the nature of cyberspace? Well, first of all, we have to recognize it's virtually impossible to have a one-to-one alignment between the geographical joint operational area that might be associated with an operation and the cyber joint operational. Why is that? Well, first of all, we are in a very cyber-rich environment, and we talk about, even in the context of deployed out-of-area operations, when we deploy our NATO command elements and the national forces supporting them, each one of them is not operating in an autonomous deployed network. They're heavily dependent on various redispatch arrangements. There are also, those arrangements may have dependencies on the commercial infrastructure. So in some cases, we are augmenting military satellite communication systems with commercial SATCOM systems. Even in some cases, the military SATCOM systems are being operated under contractual arrangements. So those are interconnected. Those ground stations, those command and control elements that make that possible are integrated often into the domestic infrastructure of the domestic cyberspace. This means that we're talking about things that are not exclusively within the control of the NATO command element. They're not exclusively within the control of the individual national military commanders involved in the operation. So this issue of how do we apply that doctrine in the context of integration of cyberspace into a joint operation, how do we translate what is the effective cyberspace joint area of operation associated with that? I would argue, as I do in the paper, that at this stage it's virtually impossible to make that mission-specific or theater-specific, and that's one of the reasons I think you will see that most of those organizations who have established a defense cyber capability are treating it more as a centrally managed strategic capability. And just as an illustration of this, let's take the Alliance Ground Surveillance System, the AGS system. Here we see, we see these kind of NOV1, operational view 1, architectural views very often, where you see not just the UAVs, but you see the reach-back arrangement. So for AGS, the two primary C2 paths to the vehicle, are Ku-band SATCOM, commercial SATCOM, and Inmarsat. So those are two commercial services integral for a key ISR asset. That data feeds back for long-term analysis and production into a main operating base in Sigonella. That base is a one-off base. We don't have alternate arrangements of that. So that's kind of a single strategic asset that would support, say, multiple operations in parallel. Another unique aspect is, of course, the nature of the threat, and we've heard some about that this morning. First of all, the fact that we have asymmetries in the relationship between the attacker and defenders. Who are the threats that we see? As you've heard in this morning's panel, we're not just talking about state actors, we're also talking about non-state actors, criminal elements, individuals. As we go further down that list, we're getting into an area which becomes much more problematic for us to engage in the context of traditional military command and control arrangements. Secondly, we have the fact that many of these attacks are happening. In fact, you see the data from a number of sources. They're more likely to be happening, at least in terms of numerical occurrences, to be happening below the level of crisis. Attribution is problematic. There are those who say attribution is something that needs to be reserved to those states that have the access to the kind of reliable production intel that can make that assessment. The effects are not always immediate, and the detection could be take a long time between the creation of the effect and the detection by the attacked systems. And obviously, we have this huge dependency upon the non-military systems. This is not just about the military CIS being protected. So what that means is the kinds of analogies that you might use in other domains of operation don't apply as well here. So we would never, I think, accept an air defense system that would be able to detect that there might have been an adversary aircraft, although we're not sure it was an adversary or some other non-state actor that penetrated our airspace sometime within the last 140 days. You know, that's the kind of paradigm would not be accepted for air defense. It's business as usual in cyberspace. What does that mean in terms of military operations? In terms of the focus of why are we doing this, I think one of the good things that was concluded in the military command's recommendations to the military committee in terms of why we should have cyberspace adopted or recognized as an operational domain by NATO is that we needed to focus on mission assurance. If nothing else, as we become more and more cyber dependent, as the nature of those dependencies becomes far, far, far more complicated, as the lines between the systems we own and the systems that we depend on become much more difficult to draw, then it becomes very much a matter of saying we need to make sure that whatever cyberspace operational capabilities we have, we focus them towards essentially making sure that this does not affect our ability to continue to perform the mission. It's not an IT problem, it's a mission problem. So what I often have said to General Athanasiadis, that his division was not created to look over the backs of the CIS staff to say, do your job better, but to say to the operational staffs, how are you using these systems, how are you dependent on them, and what could be the effects if you have these types of disruptions or other types of attacks upon these systems? Do you know what you would do? Do you know how you would respond? Do you have alternate means to do that? Because if you don't, maybe we need a backup. We need alternate arrangements. We need to put some resilience into the system so that single attacks are not going to have an effect. And I think that's one of my favorite lines in the area of network security, cybersecurity, comes from a guy named Dan Keir, who said, it's more important to be able to absorb a loss than to be able to prevent a loss. You know, you can do everything you want to try to protect your system, but as long as there's one vulnerability can be exploited, you have the potential for the loss. A well-protected system is the one that can have those losses and continue to operate. And so we need to also consider the full scope. Because of those facts, we need to consider the full scope of cyberspace, not just the military CIS, but the whole, what some have called the littorals, which means those areas where we start to verge from the cyber domain into the physical domain. So for example, the fact that every one of the CIS systems that we're trying to protect is dependent on some source of electric power, just as an example. I think one of the other messages we have is, and this, you can see this as either a blessing or a curse. What's the curse of cyberspace as an operational domain? The curse is it's under attack every day. Of some type or another, attacks are going on. We see this evidence all over the place. Are they politically or militarily significant? That may be debated, but they go on. They can affect our operations. They can disrupt our ability to maintain effective command and control. What do we do about that? So I think one lesson that has been learned in many other areas of collective defense is if you wait for the crisis to happen, it's too late to get organized to respond to it. And this message needs to be understood in cyber defense as well. So we need to have, the authorization, General Fuller said, what are the C2 arrangements? So if General Athanasiadis was to call General Fulmer today to say, we're seeing these things on NATO networks, what are you seeing in the Netherlands? That's an informal conversation today. There's no arrangements. General Fulmer could well within his right say, I'm not authorized to talk to you about that, and hang up the phone. Because none of this kind of authorities of why is secure empowering, delegating the responsibility down to General Athanasiadis to look at this on a given Wednesday afternoon, those arrangements do not exist today. We need to put them in place so that we are cooperating. Now, that does not mean that our expectation is that NATO will become essentially the joint operational commander in cyberspace on a continuing basis over and a full construct of NATO military cyber forces. But it does say one unique aspect of cyberspace compared to air, land, and maritime is we don't own, there is no such thing as the NATO land, the NATO air, the NATO maritime or sea space. There is NATO cyberspace. We do have NATO enterprise systems within the command structure, within NATO organizations, within NATO headquarters that are owned and operated and protected by NATO and is, as we well recognize, a high visibility target, the sort of things that we might see affected by attacks by adversaries, even well below the level of crisis. It would be sensible to have that day in, day out, Wednesday afternoon arrangements, those arrangements in place, that authority in place, so that we can say at least the information sharing, the calibration, because the chances are very high that if we're seeing effects in the NATO enterprise, it's probably being seen on the part of more than one nation, and that we need to protect the alliance to better collective cyber defense through allowing us to jointly coordinate our response. Now, that's still, of course, the protection measures that get put in place have to be done within the authority of each sovereign nation and each network service provider and each owner of the portion of the overall NATO cyberspace. We're not saying that we take on the authority over that, but at least to have that standing responsibility, the mechanisms in place, the procedures, the rules of engagement, even rules of engagement for a purely defensive mission. These are all reasons, if we want to operationalize cyber, we have to consider about those things, and we have to put them in place to be effective on a day-in, day-out basis, and not just when we get into a crisis. And that's why we're arguing, at least as I argue in the paper, that the NATO military command structure has an important part to play on a continuing basis below the crisis stage. For one thing, we end up paying the bulk of the O&M For most of the NATO enterprise core services, we pay the O&M for the NSERC, for example. We pay the O&M for the malware information sharing platform. We believe that that needs to be under some sort of command and control arrangement so we know why are we sharing, what information are we sharing, why are we sharing it, how do we make sure that that's being done in the best interest of the alliance. We have an existing arrangement that can be invoked by Keir over the NATO CNI agency to give us command and control, operational command and control over selective elements if they're relevant to military command and control of our operations. And we also actively participate in information sharing in the other operational domains on a routine basis. We do the force preparation, we do the exercise and training that helps this become business as usual for joint military operation. And we believe we need to start doing that now, not just in the context of a crisis, but today on a Wednesday afternoon in preparation. And actually, I would say, to ensure deterrence, because a well-protected alliance is, in fact, one that's able to deter attacks in cyberspace because, as General Fulmer said, we make the cost of the attack too high for the adversaries. So in conclusion, yes, we have a clear decision by the heads of state and government to establish cyberspace as an operational domain. We're busy doing that. General Athanasiadis will give you some of the details about what's going on there. But there's some key open questions that we do need to address, and we need to make sure that we get consensus among the allies on how we address those for us to really make this a full-fledged operational capability in the context of NATO operations. And with that, I will turn it over to Keir.
Thank you, Brad. So it seems that with all of the argument and negotiation and discussion that preceded a collective decision on recognition of cyber as a domain, in terms of operationalizing it, it is just the beginning of the conversation, not the end. Brad's raised a few open questions, as you heard. Brigadier General Athanasiadis will pick up some of them towards the end of our session. But in the meantime, we're going to hear from Catherine, because Catherine, with her academic and legal perspective from outside NATO and also her extensive national security experience in the United States, has some ideas on what NATO could or should be aspiring to and what NATO cyber would look like in an ideal world. Please share.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here and having me join the conversation. So to begin with, to give a little background on how I came to think of some of these challenges and then write an article about it, I was working with two other folks from the US, both former DoD policy officials. And it was really the summit in 2014, NATO's, at that time, the Wales Summit, where NATO talked about and invoked the concept of framework nation. And so we started thinking about, in the cyber context, was there relevance for this concept of a framework nation? And then by last year, when at the next summit, NATO announced that cyber was an operational domain, we then sat down and drafted and published an article with the Atlantic Council on NATO and cyber extended deterrence. And we began, and so I'll take a few of our points from the article. We can talk about it more, and for those of you more interested, but I'm briefly going to describe some of the recommendations that we came up with. To begin with, we were focused on the high-end conflict. So certainly an area in which NATO has to be concerned about. We're not talking about crime and espionage, but we're talking about conflict and talking about like tier 4, tier 5 adversaries. So we're in that situation. And the presumption is that what we believed was that NATO could be doing more with respect to, and that's why we use this doctrine of extended deterrence in the cyber domain without changing any legal authorities. Now there will be, and Ambassador De Caro, who's worked with us on this topic, has already challenged us when it came to resources, things like that. There will be some issues when it comes to cost sharing, which there always are. But we came up with a number of recommendations based upon this idea that if you take the extended deterrence doctrine, which is typically applied in the nuclear scenario, but if you thought about it in the cyber domain where we clearly have weaker links, not all of the members of NATO are equally equipped with their cyber capabilities. And so with my own thinking, having always think about, you're only as strong as your weakest link, we then began to take the extended deterrence doctrine and see what we could come up with respect to NATO's operations, what NATO is not yet doing, or has just maybe begun to think about doing, where they could take that. So the concept is that there'd be stronger members of NATO with stronger cyber capabilities that, through an extended deterrence doctrine, would be helping the other allies, those that are less capable cyber-wise. The benefit for all of NATO and all allies, it is similar to giving NATO the command structure, situational awareness. At the end of the day, so the recommendations we make, what the end product should be, is that NATO should be able to have more resiliency for its own systems and networks, but also be able to improve on the vulnerabilities that exist among the nation states as well. So some of the things that we focused on that was, I wouldn't say controversial, but maybe not the normal way that NATO goes about things. One of the important issues for the article is we focused on NATO working with specific private entities. We identified and spent quite a lot of time in the United States mainly, some trips abroad talking to the electric grid operators and also the telecommunication operators. We picked these two sectors, if you will, because in speaking with the US military mostly, these seem to be the two most critical infrastructure that are directly tied to military operations. That they need, of all the sectors, we could probably add a couple more, but we identified ISPs and the grid operators as to key entities that NATO needs to be working with. And another premise of the paper is that we concluded that you can't start doing the work that we recommend in a time of crisis. This is work that has to be, and we've heard this in a number of different ways, it has to be done now. And as Ambassador De Caro said, it is less than a year from when it was declared a domain of operations, but reality was that existed prior than a year ago. So there are some things that we actually think that are of urgent need to look at. So we did focus on, in the article, protecting military networks, right? So squarely within NATO's authorities, but also looking to the telecommunications infrastructure and the electric grids. Now, I'll put off any discussion of offensive later, but how we viewed offensive is that the defense is necessary for defense and for when you're in the middle of a crisis and you need to respond with military operations. So whether you call it offensive today, we can call it defense, but you're gonna need to know what your critical assets are, how you're gonna protect them in cyber, and you need to already have the capabilities among the nation states to respond. And that's gonna all be coordinated. So taking steps in advance in our article, with the telcos and with the electric grid operators globally will be very important. So here are we came up with three recommendations, basic recommendations, and there's a lot more detail in the article, but starting off with the concept that came out of the Wales Summit in 2014 on a framework nation concept. We said, well, first recommendation is to build what we just called the cyber framework nation. Now we offer it up because we're Americans and that's what we were thinking about, that a strong country with cyber capabilities like the US might be able to be this framework nation, but it could be others, the UK and others. There's a good number of members of NATO that have strong capabilities. But those countries would step up, and it doesn't just have to be one. And here using the concept that NATO already bought into, applying it in cyber, in some of the examples we came up with, what would that nation do? So with respect to being a framework nation, we thought in terms of the cyber, that country could effectively go and help the other nations, for instance, in their intrusion detection systems, their forensics capability in the cyber domain, as well as the resilience capabilities. Our second recommendation was establishing operational partnerships with these key private entities, both the ISPs and the electric grid operators. So these were the two that we believe were the most closely connected with priority military assets that you need to be able to operationalize and operate in military conflict, even while you're under an environment that's already been compromised. So to get the network operators on board with you, to understand each nation's vulnerabilities and capabilities before, just as NATO needs to know where our jets are, where the planes are, where the tanks are, you also need to have a view of the landscape of in cyber, where are our weak points globally, where are our stronger capabilities to anticipate where maybe the adversaries might be going. The third recommendation that we had was to develop doctrine and capabilities for effective use in conflict as part of NATO's warfighting capabilities. So here, it would be about developing cyber tools to potentially disrupting the adversary's communications, logistics, and sensors. So these were the 3 steps that, although we see some of these, the beginning steps in the Warsaw Summit, we believe that these 3 are the ones that are not yet kind of extended enough, meaning worked on enough, and that we said if you have to limit the amount of things that you do, we thought these 3 would be the most effective. On the first one that I mentioned, I'll just say it in a little more detail that we also talked about in the article. On having a cyber framework nation, one of the frameworks that we used in the article as an example, and it doesn't have to be, is what the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US came up with, was their cybersecurity framework. So this was a set of internationally recognized standards for cybersecurity, all voluntary based, but they identified that the NIST framework identifies 5 function areas, if you will. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And we thought about the framework nations for cyber utilizing a standard like NIST, and there can be others as well, but in the cyber realm, so for identifying purposes. So here, with respect to the nation states and members of NATO, to identify, you would first work the nation, the strongest capable cyber nations, would look to identify the highest priority military assets. So one needs to know first, what are the critical military assets that we need to function, no matter how compromised we might be. And then, and importantly for our paper, was to work with the ISPs and the electric grid operators with respect to those critical military assets to make sure that in a high-end conflict, these are going to be operational. The second function of the NIST standards on protect, here we talked about automated intrusion detection systems and developing the resiliency efforts. On the detecting function of NIST, we were talking about providing shared information. Now, NATO has an intelligence fusion center. Ambassador De Caro mentioned about improving sharing of information. You know, in this area, we were less knowledgeable about the extent of that sharing. What we did believe, though, in order to detect under a standards like NIST, you really needed to have a very robust sharing of cyber threat intelligence information across the nation states under the auspices of NATO. In terms of responding, this is where we thought that NATO, and connected to their exercises, but NATO needs to have cyber defense playbooks that are regularly exercised. And I saw Ambassador De Caro did mention that in the exercise, the lock shields, that there were private industry involvement. What we would think would be of priority would to be make sure that your telcos and the electric grid operators are in those exercises. And then the last function of the NIST standard on the recovery. And we thought about, and we mentioned maybe NATO having flyaway teams, and this could be in conjunction with the response teams that they already have. But there were 2 internationally operating entities that we thought could be useful, used as an example. One is the National Grid. So they operate internationally and have partnered with other countries, as well as NANOG. This is a North American organization of network operators. They're global. Entities like that can cooperate with the different individual nation states, but also under NATO's command structure. So these were just to highlight the big recommendations. Like I said, when we analyzed our recommendations and thought about applying the extended deterrence, as well as the Cyber Framework Nation concept. We didn't see anywhere where any new authorities, or we weren't breaking any of the rules, in other words, that NATO operates under. The most sensitive area that we got feedback from was our discussion of working with the private entities, right? The telcos and the electric grid. But we felt that that is absolutely critical. Now, how you go about doing that, it's going to still be based on the individual nations, but there has to be some level of a cross-border understanding about what the grid looks like here versus there. And that's got to be done, at least our thoughts were, way before we're in the middle of a crisis, that we're NATO. And we also felt that in terms of Article 5, having these steps, and there are probably others, we're still thinking about other possibilities, but taking these steps now would also, we believe, assist when NATO actually has to make that determination as whether Article 5 is triggered. So if, thinking like a lawyer, there's going to be lawyers involved in it, there's going to be policy people, but doing these things, having a situational awareness of all the allied members in the cyber and having more capable cyber allies helping others, I think will actually have a great positive impact in helping the NATO actually make that decision. Like, are we in an Article 5 situation now? Doing these kinds of things we think will also be helpful in that sense as well. So I'd be happy to talk a little more about some of the more details about the article, but those were some of the high-level thoughts that we had.
Thank you, Catherine. And to make it easier for people to find the article where you lay out all these proposals, can you remind us of the title?
Oh, it's on the Atlantic Council website, NATO Cyber Extended Deterrence.
Okay, great, thanks. So some promising proposals, and if only not breaking the rules were the same as not colliding with NATO realities at an early stage. But there was an underlying theme to some of your proposals which goes to the heart of some things that it's difficult to understand when looking from outside NATO. And that is the thought process behind the question, does NATO cybersecurity protect NATO or just NATO computer systems? This also comes up in some of the things that Brad was mentioning. And now if we turn to General Athanasiadis, you can pick up some of the next steps as you see it in shape for how exactly this is to be operationalized.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Keir. First of all, I want to clarify that I know my name is difficult. It could be easily used as a strong password. So today, ladies and gentlemen, generals, in the next 10 minutes, I will try to give you a short picture of what we are doing in NATO regarding the cyberspace. And you may be aware that 1 year ago, the NATO defense ministers agreed to recognize cyberspace as a domain of operations. And this decision was reaffirmed by the NATO heads of state. And they declared that cyberspace is considered a domain of operations, and NATO must defend itself as effectively as it does in the other traditional domains. What are the implications of the military implications of the decision? For us, the implications are very broad, and they will keep us thoroughly engaged in the next 3-4 years. And that's why the strategic commands in NATO were tasked by the NATO headquarters to develop a plan to define the path towards the implementation of this concept. This plan was developed by the strategic commands, ACO and ACT in NATO, and we call it the Cyber Domain Roadmap. It's an ambitious plan which drives us in 3 years to implement this concept. But first of all, when we talk about an operational domain, we should talk also for an operational capability. And this is what happens also with the cyberspace. And this capability is broken down into the projected 8 elements. These are the basic structural elements that define the path towards the implementation of the concept, of the concept to make operational the cyber domain. And of course, it must be noted that these lines of capability development should be easily applied by any large organization such as NATO or a big company, because they expand to the whole area of lines of business, and the business for NATO is operations. So this capability development will offer to our military forces a clear understanding of the critical dependencies upon cyberspace and the need that we need to develop protective measures and protect our systems and to give to our systems sufficient resilience. That means that even if they are attacked, the mission can be carried out. And this drives to the mission assurance concept, as it was mentioned by Brad earlier. And of course, in order to align cyberspace into other traditional domains and move forward to the mission assurance concept, we need to assess or reassess a broad range of processes we have in NATO. And because this, we have a new status now. We have a new domain, the cyber domain, that cross-cuts the other domains. And this effort also will include processes regarding the operational planning and execution. And we should consider also the political consultation and coordination, as well as the relation between military processes and civil processes. Now, in NATO, for those who may not be familiar with the structure, we have on the upper level of command, NATO command structure, and the lower level we have NATO force structure. We have to align cyberspace within NATO command structure, but we have to think also, and this is what we are doing through the roadmap implementation, we have to think what are the implications and the alignments of cyberspace within NATO force structure. And we may need to review the organization structures or to adapt them in order to align the new domain into operations. And of course, we have the partner nations, and we are going to see how to incorporate the information share process into our relations with our partners. In other words, how we can share information with our partners. And I want to make a clarification. Several times, we see that we give a different meaning to the information sharing. Information sharing means that we exchange information, the releasable information. It's not just receiving information. That's why today we suffer from this information sharing. Now, our next big challenge is to further mainstream cyber into overall framework of joint operations. And although much of our effort was focused on the traditional domains, now we have to take into consideration also the other areas like strategic communication, special operations, and space. And it could be summarized that the establishment of cyberspace as an operational domain is the seamless alignment, integration, and synchronization of cyberspace activities across the full spectrum of alliance operations and missions, enabling joint operational effects and the accomplishment of NATO core tasks. We also need to work with the existing frameworks and the existing disciplines, because they're part of the work for developing doctrine, procedures, force structure, capabilities, and interoperability requirements for cyberspace. A part of this work will concern to see what we can get from the existing frameworks. And we see that there are a lot of carry forwards to support the development of the new framework, the new concepts. And ladies and gentlemen, give me 1 minute to talk about the current structure we have in NATO. We have established a new cyber division 1 year ago, and it was a significant enhancement of the existing cyber defense branch. And also 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we established the Task Force Cyber in NATO. What the cyber division in NATO is responsible for, and this is as you can see on the slide, the cyber division is responsible to provide mainly to develop, maintain, and offer to our commander, Keir, the cyber situational awareness and warning capability. This is the core task for the cyber division, because Keir expects from his subordinates to give him an alert. What is the implication on our business, on our operations? And this cyber situational awareness and warning capability comprises the threat assessment, the cyber threat assessment, the cyber operational assessment, and the cyber network assessment, and on a strategic level. So we will not report to our commander that the IP address doesn't work or such a kind of things. We can advise our commander that we can go on with our operation with some risks or without risks, or with these impacts. And of course, the cyber division supports the Task Force Cyber, which is established in our operational center in SHAPE, and they are responsible to manage the cyber situational awareness and warning capability. Other activities within the cyber division concern the contribution to the development of concepts and policies and the capability packages, as well as being in lead in the implementation, the development of the roadmap, and the implementation of the roadmap, the approved roadmap. Also, there is a strong contribution to the exercises and to daily operations, cyber operations. And the last point for the exercises, we need to give to our training and exercises framework a more intensive cyber color with realistic scenarios. This is the only way we can exercise our people. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, cyberspace domain may be considered as a virtual global domain, comprising networks, connected or independent. However, this virtual domain requires to follow very specific and real steps, real capabilities. And this is what we try to do in NATO with close cooperation with our subordinate commands, the other strategic commands, and especially with member states. And I'm very happy since the generals have informed us today that there are good evolutions in our member states. So thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Thank you. So, perhaps we're not quite at such a standing start as we got the impression from Brad. Even if we have to wait 2 years for full operational capability, something is moving within SHAPE. The theme of information sharing has come up more than once, not only in these presentations, but also I saw in Ducaro. There's been a lot of talk about information with sharing with partners and how essential that is, but what about within NATO itself? Now, not so long ago, we were hearing from Jamie Shea how there was a critical problem with not being able to share threats and vulnerabilities information about cyber within NATO partners because there was a limited amount of trust, and even memoranda of understanding between countries at that stage had not been written. Has that problem been overcome? To what extent? What are the fora in which this can happen? Catherine mentioned the NIFC, the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center. What can you tell us about the challenges that are posed by nations only being willing to share the lowest common denominator information about threats and vulnerabilities? Brad, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Well, to me, the answer to that question ties back to whether or not we have standing tasks to do this sort of thing. And this is very important when we start to talk about particularly information sharing in the context of intelligence sharing. What a lot of people don't realize is that information sharing in the context of an international organization, in the context particularly of an international military organization, happens within some kind of context, particularly that starts with the why are you asking these questions? And this goes back to, I mentioned, if General Athanasiadis was to call General Follner or General Linehouse to say we're seeing such and such, what we do not have in place today, and this is a basic principle that we operate within NATO, is that we have guidelines for the release of information. They also correspond to guidelines for the authorization to ask for information. So when the NATO command structure wants to ask a question that could be answered through national intelligence resources, and let's bear in mind, although the NIFC is reportable to SECURE, it is still basically a framework nation construct. Nations offer intelligence to NATO on a voluntary basis in all cases, because you have to, of course, release of information to NATO is still release outside the constraints of your national guidelines for release of intelligence, which is typically treated as a national asset and a national resource. So for a nation to offer information to NATO, it will generally want to have some kind of idea of why is NATO asking this question, and is this a question that we have an interest in helping NATO to answer. That whole process is tremendously enabled through the existence of an assigned task to SECURE, whether it's an operational plan or a standing defense plan or some other mechanism that includes what sorts of intelligence is SECURE going to need in order to make an informed assessment, operational assessment, strategic assessment. We don't have an issue so much about this in out-of-area operation with live conflict. Lives are at stake. Everybody's going to want to try to do whatever it takes to ensure force protection and keep soldiers and sailors and airmen's lives from being at risk. But I come back to the question, but what about Wednesday afternoon? Below the level of crisis. What authorizations does General Follmer or General Linehouse have to provide information about cyber vulnerabilities, cyber threats, etc., to the NATO command structure? I think the answer today is it's extremely limited. It's not that we don't have the mechanisms, okay? We have a mechanism. This is one of General Athanasiadis' slides was about integrating, establishing cyber as an operational domain includes integrating it into existing operational processes. And we have an existing operational process for requesting information and to retrieve that information back, whether it's intelligence, and let's remember, you apply the term intelligence to information, and in all of our nations, it becomes subject to certain legal constraints in its release. And I think that's the key thing I want to stress is information, voluntary information sharing in a free-floating context without any sort of, it sounds wonderful. I think in reality we've seen, at least we've seen in NATO, that it doesn't necessarily produce the best results. It doesn't produce predictable, repeatable results. If you want to see that happen, there needs to be an authority to allow us to start asking the questions and to allow the national military and intelligence organizations that are going to support us to be able to release that information to us. And likewise, to understand if we release it, does it mean it's being exchanged with all the allies on an equal basis?
So work still to do. Christos, did you want to add anything on that point?
Yeah, I believe that the information sharing is the most challenging issue within the alliance, because every single member state of the alliance needs the information sharing, and it's extremely difficult to come to and analyze information regarding cyber. When it is available, needs to be shared with others. But the question which is generated then is, am I authorized to share this with my allies? Is it nationally sensitive or not? And in most cases, national sensitivity prevents of sharing information, high-level classification information sharing. This is the biggest challenge, and that's why we try to promote synergies and cooperations, not only within NATO organizations, but organizations outside NATO, such as European Union and cyber commands, of course. We try first to make the first step, which is the establishment of the platform, and to share information on the agreed level. And then we can improve further. So far, the status is, I would say, embryonic.
Thank you. I have plenty more questions, but I know I'm not the only person in the room who does. We have planned this session to give plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. You have volunteers in the audience with roving microphones. They will come to you, and please, when you have one, please do introduce yourselves and stand up. Please bear in mind, we can't actually see you from the stage, so we have no idea who's talking. And say who you are, say where you're from, and if you can, please keep the questions crisp, because from conversations beforehand, I know there are going to be a lot of them. So who's first?
Hi, my name's Thomas Grove from the Wall Street Journal. One of the biggest steps that NATO has taken in the last couple of years in terms of ensuring kind of mutual defense is the deployment of a few thousand soldiers here in the Baltics and in Poland. And I was wondering, you know, obviously cyber is this kind of borderless thing, but how does simply being geographically closer to a potential adversary, closer to Russia, actually change your understanding of cyber defense, and how do you have to kind of change your own understanding and planning? Thank you.
I'm going to cheekily amplify that question. When it comes to the EFP battalions, who are going to be in close proximity to a potential adversary who doesn't think of the problem in terms of cyber, but blends it with electronic warfare, information operations, psychological operations, etc. How are you adapting your cyber construct and concepts to adapt for the fact that they may be bumping up against something which is entirely different coming from the other side of the border?
Yeah, if I may, first of all, we don't need to move forces close to our adversaries in order to have a better understanding of their cyber concerns. As the Admiral mentioned earlier, that the distances in this virtual world are zero. So we may have the same understanding of our adversaries or potential adversaries' concerns or capabilities, even staying with our current positions. But regarding the troops development in the Baltic state areas, Baltic states, or the East European countries, it must be clarified that the nations themselves are responsible to provide protection to these forces because they are acting, they are developed in their area of responsibility. Each nation stays responsible to defend its own networks, and as long as we have forces working or acting or operating within this area, they are responsible to protect cyber, to provide the cyber protection. However, it doesn't mean that NATO stays inactive and has any responsibility. Of course, we need to monitor, we need to provide the information they need in order to improve their capabilities of their awareness. We need to continue monitoring their vulnerabilities. We need to ask them to proceed with threat assessment and vulnerability assessment, and then to recommend corrective actions. This is our role within this framework, the EFP, as you mentioned.
Right, anything?
Yeah, if I could just amplify that discussion, I think it does highlight a unique role and a unique value that the command structure could add if it was given this task. Because we have the EFP nations right now, but we do not have a kind of standing arrangement where outside the graduated response plans, particularly in the issue of cyber defense, where we as the command structure are directly engaged in, let's say, making sure that those forces are at the highest level of cyber defense readiness. And that's where we think it seems like a straightforward and natural role for the command structure to play that, to be able to look across borders and to level the playing field, if you will. And I don't mean level it by lowering it. I mean leveling it by helping us collectively raise the level of cyber defense by improving our awareness. And I'll mention about a month ago, General Athanasiadis' boss and mine, the DCOS CIS and Cyber Defense, General Walter Huhn, and I visited U.S. Cyber Command in the U.S., and one of the most illuminating observations that they passed on was that they used the military operational planning and execution process even for purely defensive purposes, because that operational planning and execution process allows you to understand the objectives, do your threat assessment, figure out what your critical systems are, figure out what their vulnerabilities are, figure out what your response mechanisms, et cetera, and particularly to be able to reach into validated intelligence to augment your decisions about where you apply, because at the end of the day, you can't afford to protect everything at the ultimate level, but you can protect the right things to avoid the most undesirable effects.
So we had a sort of an answer to Thomas's question, which is, in short, it's the nations, whichever nations are involved, that are responsible for looking after themselves. Thomas, did you have a follow-up? I thought you might, yeah. Can we have a microphone back here for a moment, please?
I guess it also kind of goes to your amplification of the question, where, dealing with things like social media and friends which are on the ground and in your Facebook page. How has NATO addressed the possibility of people you may meet in Tallinn or elsewhere and kind of letting them into your social networks? I mean, has that been addressed as a potential weakness?
Again, it goes to the boundaries of cyber. Where exactly do we define where cyber stops and where, for example, information operations begin? Are we handicapping ourselves by sticking to a strict definition of cyber when so many adversaries out there do not actually consider this a separate domain but part of information warfare? How do you feel about that, Brad?
Well, I would just suggest, and I think it was mentioned this morning by General Fulmer and others, which is, your response to a cyber effect doesn't have to be a like effect. It can be, and we think this is, in fact, for this sort of manipulation of social media. Obviously, there's multiple levels. There's personal awareness, which fortunately headlines seem to do an awful good job of making people more and more sensitive every day to the fact that this isn't just theory, it can affect them directly, and that they have a high individual cyber hygiene responsibility. In fact, the President mentioned it this morning in her address. But secondly, that we have the avenues, for example, of strategic communications, of responding to that kind of perception manipulation with a consistent message, and again, consistent across the alliance and not just leaving it to the individual responses of the individual nations.
Catherine, anything you'd like to put in there?
So I agree on the not being constrained with the in-kind responses. I mean, putting on my kind of international legal hat and thinking of what we see mainly in the cyber domain right now, and for most purposes, people saying it'll probably stay that way, is the low level, like low intensity kind of conflict, right? So you're not going to get, at least that's what most people anticipate, we're not going to get the Article 5 trigger at the armed attack level. So we have to be able to deal with all that stuff that's below Article 5. Now, there are some, this is kind of in the weeds with international lawyers writing this stuff, and I include myself, so very geeky, but there are there's a lot of thinking on this that you can have, it's called, under international law, it's the aggregate of events, where you take all of the low-level intensity. And there's support under international law for this doctrine, where individual events like a propaganda operation by themselves wouldn't come close to a UN Charter 51 or Article 5 for NATO, or even a use of force, Article 2.4. But in the aggregate, when you've got the same originating state, and here's the legal thresholds, they're not that easy. You have to know attribution, that it's the same originator. Those events have to be tied in terms of not only the originator, the cause of it, but the time factor as well. So you can't say, oh, that happened 5 years ago and now same actor. But if you aggregate these lower level events, in international law, there has been support with the idea that taken individually, not an armed attack, taken as an aggregate, maybe trips that threshold. That's going to be hard for NATO to come up. We have a hard enough problem when we have one big event thinking that's an Article 5. But the point is on the not in like kind and under international law, you don't have to respond in like kind. So I think kind of, and one of my colleagues has written on, well, a lot of people, especially at NATO, have written on hybrid war. More and more thought needs to be given on that, but to look at this in the full spectrum, that it's not just military forces, not even just cyber capabilities. Since, we've seen this back in Georgia, but in other places in the Ukraine, you have to have the whole visibility into all the different activities that adversary is doing, and almost go into court and you make a case, right? You bring all the evidence and you build a case against the adversary. Why? Because, well, mainly for NATO, you want to understand what we need to do in response. How do the individual states protect themselves? But as you said, how does NATO make sure that we're all up to the same capability? The reality is in cyber, we're not. We probably never will be. And that's why we were thinking of kind of having the cyber nation framework kind of used as, okay, let's bring the lower level or the weaker links up to par at least, so you can have that kind of at least a global view.
I think we could pull on this thread quite a bit more, because there are still plenty of unanswered questions, like if NATO is now doing cyber defense, who's doing information warfare defense? But we should take more questions, because I know there are plenty more out there. I can see a hand yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ricardo Sevilla from Swiss Armed Forces. I have two questions to Mr. Bigelow about both about the classification issue. First point is, of course, in some occasion, NATO in the past has been forced to handle sensitive information like TTPs in a non-classified way, despite the fact that they may come from source and methods that need to be protected otherwise, just because otherwise you cannot share that. And I think it would be much easier if the instrument would be put in place to make sure that the information can be handled the right way and not lower the level of protection of the information, which would impede this protection. And the second point is the same, but about not from the perspective of a partner nation, but from the perspective of the industry. While you share this information with the industry, and the industry shares information with you, you have different, let's say, interests. Cybersecurity companies do like to publish information about threats because this provides visibility on the market. And this is not the case for a government organization or for an international organization like NATO. So how can we handle this issue? Thank you.
Brad? On the first point, I think it goes back to a response that to an earlier question, which is we operate within NATO, certainly the command structure. We don't have a free-floating authorization to just give information to anybody because we think it's a good idea. We have releasability guidelines. If any of you have seen even a NATO unclassified document in the last year or so, you've probably noticed that at the bottom it says releasable to Montenegro. That's a standard thing we do on all of that. Why? Montenegro is an invited nation. They're not a member nation yet. So we have to have it recognized that that's a document that not only will go to the 28 member nations, but it will also be released to Montenegro. We see this also releasability to what are often referred to as the 7 NNNs, the 7 non-NATO nations, which include Switzerland. These are nations that have essentially already signed up on a national level to protect NATO classified information in accordance with NATO information security constraints, also personnel security constraints, physical security constraints, etc. Those are all prerequisites. That's part of the construction mechanism, if you will, for information sharing. And likewise, when you get to industry, yeah, we don't have a free-floating mandate from the council to release information to industry. And yes, absolutely, there are industries who are in the business of selling that information as a commercial service. We would want to clarify and have guidelines for that if we wanted to do that, that we had guidelines that said this is how we're going to treat this information. And it's kind of like a counterintuitive thing that a lot of people don't realize, but I think it's actually true. Once you kind of agree to the rules of how information is supposed to be protected, you can actually enable the pipes to be turned on. Those particular pipes can be turned on at a much greater rate of flow of information exchange than when there's no guidance whatsoever. We're a very conservative organization. In the absence of guidance, we're not going to just make this information available. So I think it's actually, again, if we had clear tasking of what the responsibilities were, that would then allow us to put in the release mechanisms and release guidelines to see just how far and openly this information will be shared. And I think you would actually see it become a much more active set of channels for.
I think on the classification, from a U.S. perspective, kind of coming from the intelligence community and living through the challenges of, making the tough decision of what to release. And so pre-9/11, the world was a lot different in the United States, much more stovepiped and not sharing, and that was the normal state of existence between law enforcement and intel, and even between intel and intel. After 9/11, we realized that wasn't the way to best protect the nation, and we broke down some of the walls in sharing, but then we had the opposite of challenge, too much information, right? Lost in the noise. But then we worked through these challenges. So there's and this is on a grand scale, right? The Five Eyes have been doing it for a while. But what I have seen, it's not about laws and rules. It's that a few individuals of significant seniority have to be willing to sit down and work at those original protocols, and there's risk, right? They're going to have to accept the risk that if something goes wrong, meaning it's leaked in the hands of someone that we trusted in the broader circle, that something bad might happen. But once that happens, and that had to happen in the U.S., but it took 9/11, the people, they said, okay, now it's worth the risk. But as you said, Brad, once those protocols are put in place, then what you're supposed to end up with is an automated sharing. So it is not human-based. This should not be, I know you said call General Fulmer. You shouldn't even be calling. It should be you push out, right, instead of request. Right. But you can't get to that end state until you go through a lot of organizational pain. Right. And I just saw it from one country in the U.S. with the intelligence community, and it was painful. But really what it took, it wasn't about the laws. As a lawyer sitting in the middle of these debates, we didn't have to change any laws. We didn't even need a new executive order from the president. But it did take individuals putting their neck on the line, saying, I'm going to put my name on this, and this is what I'm going to force you all to share. And then, of course, the first, insider that leaks because they had access to CyberNet, then everyone's like, well, that's because we did that. Mm-hmm. But someone's going to be willing to do that. And what we were thinking about in the article is that, I don't know who can do that in NATO, but until that happens, it's a people process more than I think authorities. That if you can physically have that happen, that's the way that we think it should go eventually.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Let's take another question. In fact, let's take two at a time, please. Hand over there.
Hi, Patrick Muldray. I'm a cyber intelligence analyst at FireEye. I'm curious about the process of Montenegro's accession to NATO. I wonder if you believe this is going to increase the cyber risk to NATO. My company has observed targeting of Montenegro in the past. There have been high-profile DDoS attacks that have followed patterns similar to what we've seen in years past, in the last decade. And I'm wondering what preparations NATO has taken and how the integration of Montenegro into NATO's enterprise network will occur, and whether there are steps taken by NATO to manage that risk. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Let's take one more at the same time. If the microphone can come down the center aisle. There we go.
Hi, my name is Lauri Tankler with the Estonian daily newspaper Eesti Päevaleht. I'm asking you about basically a hypothetical situation. If the cyber would have been a domain of operations about 10 years ago, say, and I'm asking you to use your imagination here a little bit. And Estonia, a member of NATO, was under the attacks that were already crippling our access to banks and government services and the outside world. What would you imagine would have been the response from other NATO countries? Obviously, this was not an Article 5 situation, but in terms of capability sharing, attribution capabilities, and all these kinds of things that would have been needed back then, under this sort of a new era in NATO, what do you imagine would have been the response to those kinds of attacks? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Two excellent questions, but rather sensitive ones. So let's bear in mind that everybody on this stage except me be a little constrained in how they can answer, because everybody on this stage except me has a career. So within those parameters, we've already done the information sharing aspect of inviting Montenegro into the tent. Maybe some of the technical aspects. Brad, what can and can't you say?
Well, a couple of things. NATO has a relatively standardized process because we've had numerous nations join since 1999, and we follow that essentially protocol of hooking up a nation. So we're either done with or very close to activating connections to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and the Single Service Headquarters, which provides them access to a NATO secret wide area network and also the means to exchange information with the other allies over that same wide area network. Now, in terms of what, it doesn't really affect our cyber risk in any way at all, because we also operate with the principle, longstanding, that essentially each entity involved in these interconnections of systems at whatever level of classification operate on a principle of self-protection. So it is Montenegro's responsibility to protect any of their national systems processing NATO classified to the level equivalent to which all other allies have signed up to. Those arrangements, and they will be part of the committees updating those standards and coming up with that. But we, ACO, and the NCIA, as the network service provider, will have the responsibility to assure that the NATO systems that are provided are protected on an equivalent level. So technically, it's not really Montenegro becoming part of the NATO enterprise. It's essentially the NATO enterprise being extended to interfaces, either a local enclave or a live interface to a Montenegrin system. So I don't think it affects that way.
Okay, just before we turn to Christos, a hypothetical Article 5 scenario in 2007 when a member state is coming under socio-cyber attack and possibly an aggregate of small factors, as Catherine was describing earlier. Any views? Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I just want to jump in because I think the answer to that is if we had been a domain in 2007, we would have, and you will see as we develop the roadmap, this is going to be one of the strong messages we depend, is that we need to start exercising collaboration with the allies in below crisis level scenarios. Now we do that, Cyber Coalition, I think one of the great things about that today is that is actually the kind of scenarios that are dealt with there, but it's still primarily a technical exercise and not the procedural command and control arrangements. And General Fulmer used a term that for most of the civilian audience probably doesn't mean much, but it's extremely important for military organizations, command and control. Who is supporting whom, and what authorities does the commander have? We would have hoped, had we had this in place at that time, that we would have at least been able to raise that visibility up to the level of the alliance and to reach out to the allies to say, you know, what assets do we have that can be brought to bear on this, what response options are available, et cetera, as on a process that will have at least been exercised on a regular basis. It would have necessarily guaranteed that we knew everything we had to do, but practicing that process at least gets you through the first few hours of immediate situational assessment and advice up to the council about what responses might be effective.
And General, you had something to add?
Yes, I would like to add to this. If the cyber was mature by this, cyber roadmap was, and the concept was mature by this time, 2007, we would have the rules of engagement and assessing what is the criticality of this attack and step-by-step approach. Activating also the voluntarily operational cyber effects from other allies within the alliance. All these things will be addressed in the next 3-4 years. And then by this time we can say that in case of a similar to Estonia case, we will be able to respond. First of all, the nation itself will respond with means, as the General mentioned in his speech, either with political or diplomatic or economical or cyber response or conventional response, conventional weapon response. But yes, the answer to your question is that we would have by this time all the tools to respond effectively and protect the country. First of all, we would have the early warning, the warning capability that something wrong happens. And then we could, and besides, we would have the deterrence of the cyber, regarding the cyber attacks. Nowadays, I want to ask a question. What is the deterrence? What could be considered deterrence? In the nuclear state side, we have that holding nuclear weapons, we can deter our adversaries. However, today we need to develop some capabilities that, as it's mentioned in the UK cyber policy, that all the potential adversaries or attackers, intruders, we will not have a good haven in case of an attack.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just 7 minutes left, so we're going to pick up the pace. Let's take another 2 questions and ask our panelists to keep the answers crisp if they can. Any hands, please? I have no idea what's happening out there.
Keir, if I may, to add something regarding the other question about the industry role. Today, we have companies having invested huge amount of money on the network, monitoring the network, the cyber, globally. They have created infrastructure that we as NATO organization, we cannot replicate in order to monitor the cyber, because cyberspace cannot be controlled, but what we try to do is to monitor. However, we can receive these services, other contracts we may have with industry, in order to improve the services, especially for the threat assessment, because the threat assessment is comprised, is built by the open source reports, open source intelligence or reports. I mean, the journalist writes a report regarding cyber, or classified information from intelligence services, or information analyzed by the specialist according to the information they receive globally, and the correlation of the information they may proceed with. That's why we need to have, we need the industry as to have a critical role in the information sharing for us and the threat assessment. And we do not have to focus on the open sources because the industry publishes some assessments, but when the time comes to sign a contract with an organization or another company, how to provide us critical information, then the quantity and the quality of the information differs significantly.
Thank you. Could we have a microphone to General Fulmer in the front row, please?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for excellent presentations and excellent answers. But I have one question left. What can we as nations, and especially as cyber commands, do to help NATO, to help shape with this effort?
General, if I may, thank you very much. It's a really very significant information, question, sorry, but I said information because I have in my mind information sharing. What we are trying to do to establish with all cyber commands, the new cyber commands and the older, to start talking about engagement plan. And then within this plan to define the ways, the platforms where we can start sharing information, and then to define the level of information we can. But these prerequisites the willing of the political willing to start releasing information with NATO. So far, we have made some steps with US Cyber Command and US EUCOM, and we would like to expand this activity. We have some visits from UK Cybersecurity Center, and General, you have visited the SHAPE. We have expressed this concern, but we need to work further and establish this core. And this is what we expect from our subordinate commands. And of course, we mean information sharing, not information receiving.
Brad, is there anything else on your Christmas wish list from National Cyber Commanders?
Well, absolutely, and it's very simple, and it's a message. Remember, the decisions that are taken about what we do or don't do as the NATO command structure are taken by your nations, and you're representatives of your nations. And I think one of our basic messages is cyberspace as an operational domain needs to be treated as an operational domain every day of the week. We need to have the authority, the direction, the rules of engagement, even for a purely defensive purpose, collective defense. It's federated defense. It's very much in line with federated mission networking. Your nation, of course, has to provide what it brings to the table. The NATO command structure will take care of the NATO piece. But what we need and what we don't have today is the standing tasking and the authorities and the rules of engagement so that General Athanasiadis can work with you, can work with General Linos, and can work with all of your counterparts in the NATO force structure on a day-in, day-out basis. That this is not something we should just deal with as something we practice for in the context of an exercise once in a while in the context of a larger operation. This needs to be going on every day.
Thank you. Just one final question from me. We've touched a couple of times on the extent to which NATO can provide cyber assurance for nations as opposed to for itself, for its own organization. So how much can it contribute to protecting the assets and the citizens and the soldiers of individual countries? How realistic is it, do you think, that that might change? How would you assess the realism of Catherine's suggestion of extended cyber deterrence? Briefly, if you please.
This is something that, first of all, requires a political decision. So if the member states agreed to share some capabilities to work, to function as a deterrence. And I made a reference to the nuclear capabilities we have. But today, we may, by sharing information and having the same level of warning awareness and the warning capability, we may be able to give a message to our potential intruders or our adversaries that in case that they try to attack, they have to face or to feel the results of our response, which is very severe. So it's a matter of a political will to develop these strategic methods. And of course, on the operational level, we need to share, to be ready to develop the processes, to have the process in order to share this capability. In other words, if the country Alpha has the power to kill an attacker, then this power should be, this capability should be procedurally should be able to be used in case that I am attacked by this attacker.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this panel has done everything that I hoped it would. We still have some open questions, but we also have a good picture of a work in progress and a call to action. So with that, I need to close the session. Please thank our three excellent panelists for giving up their best.
Thank you.